I will call to order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, April 5th, 2021, and ask Dave to take the roll, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Alder Carter.
Present.
Alder Harrington McKinney.
Present.
Alder Bedar.
Present.
Alder Verveer.
Here.
Alder Furman.
Present.
Alder Kemble.
Here.
You have quorum, Mayor.
Thank you. Does one of our tech facilitators have instructions for us?
Sure. All right, welcome to our virtual meeting. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. Members of the committee, if you're able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you're able, please activate your video when you're speaking. Please use the raise hand feature when you like to be recognized to speak or ask questions or request a roll call vote. During any roll call vote, all panelists will be unmuted briefly. Staff, please use the raise hand feature when you're asked a question. In this meeting, panelists have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. The chair will do the rest of calling committee members in the order in which hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. The chair or committee staff will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the committee, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Mayor, floor is yours.
Thank you. We have no general public comment. So that brings us to disclosures and recusals. Are there any disclosures or recusals on today's agenda? Seeing none, that takes us to the consent agenda. We will have separation on items 4 and 11 already. Are there any additional agenda items that alders wish to have separated from the consent agenda? Going once. Going twice. All right. No additional items for separation. So then Alder Carter will have separation on items 4 and 11. A motion on the balance of the agenda, please.
Yes, I move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
That agenda has been moved and seconded. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda? Seeing none, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda. And having separated number 4 because we had a registrant on it, I do not see that registrant in the meeting. But on item 4, we had Alex Saludos of Hammersley Ave, neither supporting nor opposing, wishing to speak. Staff, can you just confirm that we don't have Mr. Saludos?
That's correct. Nobody by that name is on this meeting right now.
Okay. So then, Alder Bedar, Alder Carter seems to have stepped away for a minute. Can I get a motion, please?
Move adoption.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Alder Verveer. That's moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion on item number 4? Seeing none, any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of item number 4? Seeing none, that vote is recorded, and we will move on to item number 11, and I will turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Mayor. I will share my screen and move through this briefing, hopefully quickly. Can everyone see that? Great. So we'll talk, as you've probably read in the media and through other channels, the American Rescue Plan Act was adopted about 3 weeks ago. It is a major piece of federal legislation to address elements of the pandemic as well as supporting economic recovery. Right. I gotta see if I can get my. All right. So just to quickly give you some background on The distribution of funds within the act is $1.9 trillion. That's with a T. And as you can see on the pie graph on the left, about half of that is directed towards individual households in a number of different ways, primarily through stimulus checks or economic recovery rebates, I think is their formal term. The next largest share are state, local, and tribal governments, about a little over a quarter of that, or $500 billion. That has been a sector that was left out of previous recovery acts in 2020. And specifically for state and local governments, there's about $360 billion. And we'll get into that in a few slides. Education and childcare is about 11% or $210 billion, with the bulk of that funding for elementary and secondary education, school districts around the country. That money goes through the states, as well as funding for institutions of higher education. Businesses and transportation, about $126 billion. Much of that is made up in both public transportation as well as airline and airport support. And then other recipients, about $98 billion, or about 5%. And the bar graph on the right kind of breaks that down more into categories, with the largest share of this 1.9 trillion for those stimulus checks, followed by the state and local government. There's another round of unemployment assistance extending the pandemic unemployment compensation through the end of August into early September at a $300 per week add-on. Major expansions of the child care tax credit, or the child tax credit, I should say, EITC, or the Earned Income Tax Credit, and other tax support, including support for healthcare premiums under the Affordable Care Act. Talked about education and broadband. Another major elements around public health workforce expansion, as well as COVID-19 vaccine and testing. There's some private pension stabilization funding, business support, which includes a shuttered venue aid program, adds funding to a program that was started at the end of 2020 in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, as well as funding for restaurant and bars that have lost revenue. Talked about public transportation, another round of funding for transit, as well as aviation, so airline support, airport support. Additional funding for FEMA and related emergency relief, as well as housing, both rental support and homeowner support, and help with paying property taxes and utility bills. Stabilization funding for childcare centers, childcare support. Additional funding for Medicaid and Medicare. Additional federal share for states that expand their Medicaid programs. And then funding for veterans, nutrition support, ag and rural support, and Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian tribal health initiatives. Just a quick look at what the city has gotten so far from the federal COVID-19 recovery response efforts. So under the CARES Act, about a little under 45 million so far, with a little over half of that for Metro Transit, and the eviction prevention funding and other housing related, about 8.8 million. Other sort of public health, Madison-Dane County funding, about 6 million. And then about a little over 5 million for COVID costs. Much of that was the routes to recovery funding received from the state's share of the coronavirus relief fund money under the CARES Act. The next large piece of legislation was the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was enacted at the end of 2020. About 23 million sort of awarded from that. again, that round of rental assistance funding, and then another round of transit support. And then under the American Rescue Plan Act, at least of what we know right now, there's obviously many other pots of funding in ARPA that will provide funding to the city or to public health. But the major elements are the local government aid. So that's estimated about $49 million. And then another $30 million for transit. So what we'll cover here is some background on that state and local government aid. Talk a bit, give you some background on the revenue losses that have already occurred and are projected to occur in 2021. Some of the guiding principles at both the national level and how we've been talking internally about the allocation of the ARPA funding. Some background on a proposed approach with use of the transit monies, which is approaching a total of almost $70 million. The internal teams have been identifying possible gaps in ARPA that might be met through some of this local government aid, and then a timeline and some next steps. So obviously the headline funding in the ARPA for basically state and local governments is this $350 billion nationally. There's another $10 billion that was added in the act for what's titled critical capital projects that'll be received by states and allocated by states. So in Wisconsin, of that $350 billion, Wisconsin state government will receive about $3.2 billion. And then the Wisconsin share of that $10 billion for critical capital, just using population share estimates, would be almost $200 million on top of that. Dane County is estimated to receive about $107 million, and the city about $49 million. In contrast to the CARES Act, which had a coronavirus relief fund for states and large metropolitan areas above $500,000, this act provides dollars to every local government in the country, regardless of its size. Those with a population below 50,000 will receive funding through the states. But Madison, as a metropolitan area above 50,000, will get a direct allocation from the Treasury. So the eligible uses of this state and local government aid is, first of all, to respond or mitigate the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. The legislation highlights some possible places where this could be invested, but that's not limited to that. So things like the inordinate effects on tourism, travel, hospitality, small businesses, and so on. Secondly, the bill also allows premium pay up to an add-on of $13 per hour and $25,000 maximum per worker for both government workers and non-government workers, with the chief executive of the government receiving the aid deciding if that option will be exercised and who might be defined if that option is exercised as an essential worker. Third, to provide funding to continue government services to basically offset the reduction in revenue associated with COVID-19. And that reduction in revenue is compared to the most recent completed fiscal year. So for Madison, that will be fiscal year 2019, calendar year 2019, what was received in revenue in that year compared to amounts received in subsequent years. And then also there is a specific category of investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. These funds are available until the end of calendar year 2024. The first half of these funds will be provided by the U.S. Treasury within 60 days of passage of the act, so no later than May 11th of 2021. The remainder will be provided 1 year later in spring of 2022. Treasury is currently developing rules about how to define all of these categories and things like, what is revenue reduction? What does that mean? And those, we will know the latest information we have is that guidance will be made available about the same time if the funding is allocated, and that funding will probably not be allocated until almost this last possible date in May. And governments will have to make regular reports to the Treasury, and funds that aren't used consistent with the guidance and the law could be required to be paid back. So some points to consider, as I mentioned, the reduction in revenue and defining that will hinge on the federal guidance. And so the federal guidance is really the key of what we can use this funding for. It is one-time funding, and you're going to hear me say that a number of times through this presentation. I'll show you some information that depending on how we look at the revenue losses, they actually exceed the amount of estimated aid. There has been significant depletion of some fund balances in the city. When we look at economic effects, they will probably continue to be sector specific and probably difficult to predict, just given how behavior will change once people return to work or don't return to work or telework and things like that. And that could have effects in future years that we don't yet know. So, for example, the net new construction factor, how many new office buildings are built in the city, the value of that, how that could affect the levy limit calculation, as well as looking at tourism, conferences, recovery, how that might affect both room tax and Monona Terrace finances. There are a number of programs in this legislation that are available to the private sector. There's a continuation of the Paycheck Protection Program. There's the shuttered venue grants, as I mentioned, the EIDL, so that's loans to businesses that are experiencing losses. There's employee retention credits. There's the continuation of the enhanced unemployment compensation. So all those programs should also be kept in mind as well as the other government funding, which is the state and county aid, for example. What's not listed here also is the school district aid and how partnerships could be identified across all of those categories. Right now, the city has about $4 million of unreimbursed costs, plus essential worker costs, and emergency paid leave and enhanced family medical leave on top of those dollars that are effectively unreimbursed. And then, of course, a primary theme of all of this funding is to build back better and focusing on long-term and broad-based economic improvements. Just a quick reminder on emergency paid leave reimbursement. So this was the first act that came out of the response to COVID-19, the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, and it created sick time and paid family leave. And the ARPA extends those through the end of September. It also expands the credits and allows those credits to be used to pay for time associated with getting the vaccine. And it adds another 10 days. So the first tranche had expired that was provided under the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act. ARPA extends it or adds another 10 days and allows state and local governments to access those credits after, so for amounts used after March 31st of 2021. There's also an expansion of COBRA for involuntary separations. Basically, employers have to cover health insurance costs. This doesn't apply to the city. We haven't had any involuntary separations. So those would be like layoffs and things like that. And we have about 2.1 million of unreimbursed emergency paid leave and family leave costs. And we have another 3 million of leave balances that have been awarded to employees, but not yet used. And the city's sort of current policy at the moment is that those balances will remain in place through the end of May. So turning to some financial background, the estimated revenue loss through 2021 compared to the 2019 budget is about $37 million. This does not include Metro because they have that sort of separate tranche of money coming to them. The general fund balance will be reduced by perhaps $10 million through the end of 2021, and that would put the fund balance at about 13% of the general fund budget compared to the 15% goal. That includes the $8 million that's budgeted in the 2021 budget, plus anticipated, particularly anticipated room tax losses compared to the budget in 2021. The parking utility balance, as many of you are probably aware, has been dramatically depleted. As you know, the strategy there has been to build up cash balances to finance the renovation or replacement of ramps. And that has been, that's no longer possible at the current balance levels. Monona Terrace's fund balance has been completely depleted and they are facing a deficit in 2021. And when looking at room taxes, now this is a preliminary estimate, but based on how 2020 finished, the adopted 2021 allocation amounts might have to be reduced by between 30 and 40% based on the revised room tax collections in 2021. Now that could change, but that's the estimate right now. The general fund effect of that is a $1 million revenue loss. And then just a reminder that the 2021 budget has one-time savings built into it. These are not ongoing savings of including the proposed the $1.2 million for temporary compensation reductions or furloughs, and then the $8 million for fund balance. This just gives you the numbers. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this breaks it down in the general fund, so the various revenue categories in the general fund, and then also includes the transit occupancy tax, which is the room tax, parking utility revenues, and Monona Terrace. As I said, Metro is not in this. If Metro were in it, it would add another 10 million of revenue losses associated with fare box collections. So you can see, looking at just the 2020 budget comparison, the loss in 2020 and 2021 totals to about $57 million. If we look at the 2019 budget as a comparison, that loss is about $39 million. And the big factor, as you can see here, and this is where the Treasury guidance will be important, is if you look at the property tax, we obviously were able to grow our property tax in 2020 and 2021 under the levy limit. And so that offsets the losses under a 2019 comparison. Now, if the Treasury, for example, allows governments to look at it by individual type of revenue, then this loss, could be calculated at a much higher level. Just again, a quick snapshot of the parking utility. If we, these are based on a series of assumptions made by the parking utility in terms of the pace of recovery of parking revenues. But right now, the estimated loss is about $32 million through 2024, and that just looks at what they thought they would get under the without the pandemic, so pre-pandemic, where their revenues and cash balances would be at, where they're projected to be under the pandemic, and then their sort of plan for how much of their reserves they would have used for the Lake Street garage replacement, for example. So about $22 million there. So major loss of revenues in the parking utility. No surprise, very sensitive to the travel restrictions and work at home guidance and so on. Room tax, this just shows room tax collections in 2020, $6 million. So a dramatic drop. And hospitality and travel has been probably one of the heaviest impacted sectors of the economy. And so a loss of about $13.5 million compared to the budgeted baseline. Right now, that's expected to recover to about $9 million, and then the recovery will pick up steam and get closer to the baseline. So about a $25 million loss through 2024. And under sort of how that revenue is shared between the Room Tax Commission and the general fund's loss will be about $7.5 million through 2024. The general fund actually picked up more of that loss in 2020 to help protect Room Tax Commission programs in 2020. Winona Terrace, they will have about a $4 million cash loss through 2021. They, as I mentioned earlier, their reserves are depleted. Their cash balance, they still have a positive cash balance, but that will be depleted by the end of 2021 based on current projected activity. Turning back to the general fund, just a quick reminder of both what happened in 2020 and what's budgeted in 2021. In 2020, we basically right now, the general fund is pretty much held steady and still is at about 16% of the subsequent year's budget, and our target is 15%. But that happened because we were able to take advantage of the federal funding under the CARES Act that Metro received, and that replaced the general fund subsidy to Metro. That's about $8.6 million. And we got the CARES Act funding through routes to recovery from the state for COVID costs. And so picked up over $13 million of benefit through the federal stimulus legislation, and that helped protect the general fund balance, at least in 2020. And then, as you all know, the city's been engaged in a number of administrative actions to limit hiring. It redeploys staff. It's closely monitoring management contracts, obviously no travel. So that helped save on costs as well. And then in the 2021 budget that we're about 1/4 of the way through, permanent cuts were made. There was no pay increase for general municipal employees. We talked about the $1.2 million reduction, which is temporary, the $1.5 million in police and fire reductions. There were some revenue increases in that budget, which include increases in the ambulance fee, building permit fees, and then fee charges for services from the town of Madison for taking over fire and inspection services. And then that allocation of a sizable amount of the general fund balance to make everything balance. So going into 2022, we have at least a $9.2 million gap from those one-time items in addition to structural gap. And we'll get into what that looks like in future meetings as we develop the outlook for 2022. So that's the financial background. Turning to the guiding principles and priorities, looking at one of the national organizations that put out some guiding principles is the Government Finance Officers Association. Again, just emphasizing that the funds are one-time and should be applied to one-time expenditures. That idea of partnerships, there's a lot of funding coming to a lot of different levels of government, as well as nonprofits, and how can partnerships be identified to best invest these dollars. And then taking the time, these funds are available through 2024 to consider alternatives and make the best investments. I think to also important to highlight here is our credit rating. So our bond rating, in effect, is going to be closely monitored by the rating agencies, in our case by Moody's. How do we use these ARPA funds to replenish balances and address long-term structural issues and not set up structural problems in the future? And then the unique opportunity of this funding. These are the guiding principles that the mayor and the city's funding and recovery team have been operating under as they started to at least think through and plan out how to use this funding. And I won't go through them, but you can see the 5 areas here of, how do we adapt to COVID? How do we, keep our environment sustainable. The headline focus on equity, the area of financial sustainability that I just covered on the previous slide, and then this idea of health around food access and housing and issues like that. And so some of the priorities are obviously going to be COVID-19 and the public health improvement associated with vaccination and testing, housing, food, childcare, broadband, and access to that, broad-based and long-lasting business recovery and job creation, and then the transit access, expanding transit access, and so on. Turning to transit, as I mentioned, this transit, the city metro will be receiving from a combination of the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and now ARPA, a total of about $69 million. And a preliminary plan from Metro is to use roughly a little more than a third of that to replace other federal funding that they get, and then that money will be available for future capital, primarily bus purchases. Another third, a little more than a third, will be to replace lost revenues. So they have obviously lost a lot of fare revenue, including the loss of the general fund subsidy that I mentioned earlier. Spend another 10 million of that 69 million on their technology upgrade, which is in the 2021 capital budget funded from GO debt. This would replace it with federal funding and reduce the debt in that area. And then spend some of these monies on capital improvements through switching out some other funding sources. But the net result would be making capital improvements that will help reduce their operating costs in the long term. You'll hear more about this in the future, in the near future, but this is just sort of the general plan at the moment on the transit allocation of the transit dollars. Some other key programs in ARPA are, as I mentioned before, the housing and rental assistance, the education funding, the child care, and the business support, which we've covered earlier. The county at the moment, these are some of the sort of headline areas that they're looking at investing their funding, including continued allocation dollars to and continuing those dollars for food security that they've already done. The CARES Act funding they've allocated is quickly running out. They're looking at some funding to help bridge the time between the federal dollars are available for business assistance with the funding that they're getting immediately through ARPA. Mental health assistance for the school age population, a transition strategy around those homeless that are being sheltered in hotels and motels and using CARES Act funding. Some of that they're going to use for telework and hybrid work situations, and helping some nonprofits that may have lost their own source revenues during the pandemic. Some possible gaps in this funding that the funding and recovery team has identified include funding for youth, and you can see the various programs there, affordable housing, and small businesses that may not be eligible for the federal support or might continue to be heavily impacted. Access to information technology and the internet, broadband, and so on for residents, and then infrastructure modernization around a more technology-based connection for the community and the workforce. There are other pieces of federal legislation, major pieces of federal legislation that are coming through, and you've, again, probably seen information on those already. The first is the appropriations bill, or the federal budget for the fiscal year that begins October 1st of this year. And already the city has identified a series of what are called community project funding proposals for Representative Polkan, Congressman Polkan around this. And all members of these committees are getting proposals, and these will all be sorted through and prioritized, and have to see which one of these make it into the appropriations bill. Another piece of federal legislation is the Surface Transportation Act, or the FAST Act. That's being reauthorized now. That has a 5-year horizon, and again, more opportunities for local projects. And then you probably just read about the recent proposed infrastructure bill, over $2 trillion. That has an 8-year horizon and a number of proposals in it, including around affordable housing, more funding for transit, and funding for bridge replacement and other infrastructure. So the next steps, I think this is the last slide, is the funding and recovery team. There's various work groups that continue to identify those gaps and come up with prioritized options. The mayor will probably speak more to this, but she'll be having one-on-one meetings with council members about to discuss this federal funding as well as city budget priorities. This the transit plan that I laid out, there'll probably be there will be a resolution on that later this month or in early May. We'll provide another update on the federal funding situation at the next meeting of the Finance Committee. As I said, the guidance on this local government aid will be available around second week of May, as will the funding. And all of this will require action by the council, probably in multiple resolutions, beginning in the next couple of months. And we'll continue to monitor interactions with other federal legislation. So that's a lot. I'll stop talking. If you have any questions, or Mayor, if you wanted to obviously say any more on this. So.
Thanks, Dave. I do want to add just a few things. One is that I and my staff have been trying to reach out and have conversations with the other entities that are likely to be receiving funds, or that we know will be receiving funds, obviously including the county, the state, the school district, to see what their plans are and how we might be able to collaborate and leverage the money coming into our community to the best effect. And we'll keep you updated. At this point, there's sort of, I think everybody's in the same place of having some high level thoughts, but not a lot of specifics yet. But I did want you to know that those conversations are ongoing. And then as Dave indicated, we will be scheduling, Nicole will be reaching out as of Wednesday to schedule meetings with the whole council to talk about committees, the rescue funds, and the budget as we get into starting the capital budget process. I want to make sure that I'm hearing from the whole council on your priorities. So look for invitations from Nicole on yet this week. Certainly happy to answer questions or to hear ideas now as well. But I'll turn it back and see if we have any questions specifically for Dave. Walter Carter? Walter Carter, you're muted.
One of the things that you went over, Dave, was that it looked like that small businesses weren't a priority in this and weren't getting as much money as some of the other areas. Can you just tell me how much small business recovery is going to be getting?
Nationally? Is that your question?
Right.
Yeah,
within the funding that they're proposing.
Yeah. The reason this is a smaller share in this round is that business support was a major element of the CARES Act, as well as the Comprehensive or Consolidated Appropriations Act. I think how you characterize the business support varies, but probably around $30 to $50 billion of what is in here. Now, that does not include like unemployment compensation to individuals or the stimulus checks or anything like that. This would be direct funding for example, shuttered venues. I think there's about 15 billion for that. There's also a restaurant and bar program. I think that's about 25 billion nationally. And then a lot of support for airlines and to continue jobs in airlines, which was also a major element of the CARES Act as well. So the reason it's a smaller share is, a lot of focus on the stimulus checks and on state and local government aid. And state and local governments had not been a major part of the previous two recovery acts.
And Dave, can you just, I think I'm correct in this, but please just confirm that small business or the business aid is moving either through the federal or the state governments in general. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mayor. It's primarily through the federal government. Small Business Administration is doing a lot of that, yep. Or the Economic Development Administration.
And this is my final question, is the affordable housing, which you mentioned, is that also part of the eviction prevention, or is that two separate line items?
So there's two separate, there is another round of sort of rental assistance funding, similar to what was in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And then kind of new to the recovery legislation that we've seen so far is homeowner assistance. Mm-hmm. So help with payments of things like property taxes, utility payments, and things like that.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Are there other questions for Dave? Alder Verveer?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you so much, Dave, for your very comprehensive presentation. I have to admit that most all of the questions that I had were answered when I read the slides in Legistar before the meeting. I did have a couple of quick things. One is a follow-up to President Carter's initial questions about small businesses. I am reminded that when we were debating here in this committee, the grant to Nehemiah that Matt Mikolajewski shared with us at the Small Business Equity and Recovery Program of the cities was running short on available funds due to the immense popularity of our COVID grant program. I'm wondering if you have any update for us, and I realize this is perhaps something you were not prepared for, but if you have any information as to where we are with SBER and funds available under that program. And I presume, based on your presentation, that we possibly could use some of this federal money to supplant SBER funding generally. Is that correct?
That's probably a possibility, Alder Verveer. This probably would qualify as an economic recovery program. I don't have any updated numbers on SBER. I know Matt Wachter is in this meeting, and he might have some information on that.
Thank you.
Matt?
I don't have the dollar figures in front of me, but just sort of piggyback on, I think, this line of thinking. Just like Dave said, we applied to Representative Pocahn's office for appropriations. Nonprofit partners also were able to do so, and I believe that Nehemiah was one of those who applied directly for funds. And then additionally, when Dave was speaking of gaps in programs, I mean, really the exercise that we're doing is trying to go through all the lists of potential things we'd spend money on, figure out what fits well into the recovery program, which fits better as a appropriation, which is surface transportation, which is infrastructure, and then what doesn't have a home. And then those are projects that we would need to find alternative funding sources for. So that's really sort of the sifting that we're trying to do with all these things as new guidance comes out on the funding programs.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mayor, you obviously probably don't need a reminder that you and I have also talked about SBER when we met the other day. And so I appreciate your assurance that it'll be taken care of. There are so many exciting initiatives under that program that it would be a shame if we didn't have funding to accomplish most of those yet this year. My second quick question here, Dave, is about the shuttered venue grant program and how it might relate to any city agencies, most particularly Monona Terrace. Is my understanding correct that based on information that we have from the federal government so far, Monona Terrace would not qualify for a shuttered venue grant?
That's my understanding, that they would not qualify.
Are you aware of any programs that might assist Monona
No.
Terrace directly, given their deficit situation or their fund balance?
Other than the local government aid that
Yeah.
I referenced, no, we have not seen anything that's focused on venues like Monona Terrace.
Okay. There might be a chance, perhaps, if the state might choose to qualify Monona Terrace. Is that possible? I realize it's very preliminary at this point, but we were the beneficiaries, as you know, of that grant through DOA at Monona Terrace. But at this point, is it fair to say that, and I appreciate, Mayor, you saying you're in regular communication with our partners at the state and county and how they might be using their funds, that it's premature to know if there's any state funding that might be available to Monona Terrace?
I would say it's premature, yes, but
I haven't heard anything specific, Alder Revere, about that. But I'll add it to the list of specific questions for them.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And Dave, were you trying to say anything else? Okay.
I did not.
Very good. Thanks again, Dave, for your excellent presentation. Look forward to continuing the conversation at our next meeting on the 26th. Then. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Badar?
Thank you, Mayor. I did have just one process question. As you mentioned, that you're having kind of high-level conversations right now with the other entities that are receiving funding. Do you have kind of a vision about what that may look like? I think it's really critical and important to kind of identify together who's doing what and kind of try to align, I guess, the work. So any sense of what that process may look like from a legislative body perspective? Has there been any conversation of, the involvement, I guess, school board, county board and city council?
There hasn't yet. We're scheduling the MMSD meeting. Certainly want to discuss that. And with the state, the conversations so far have been pretty high level conceptual desire to cooperate and, let's share lists of ideas and projects. On our end, as Dave said, obviously, everything will need to run via resolutions or I guess budget amending resolutions through the council, regardless of what we do. But although you're absolutely correct that's the whole point of the conversation, is to make sure that we're pushing in the same direction. And it's really too early to say where that collaboration might be. But just for example, we all know that we need to invest in making more households, making broadband more available to more households. And so that might be a place that we might be able to see some collaboration. I know it's a priority for the state. It's obviously important to us. It's important to the school district. So I think that there will be plenty of areas for us to consider collaboration. And it's really going to be a question of, how is that structured? And then certainly on our end, it will need to run through the council. and likely need to have pretty robust conversation in advance of that. I don't think any of this is, I mean, we're all eager, right, to get these dollars on the street and helping the community, but I think it is going to be a process to get to that point. Other questions? All right, seeing, Alder Harrington McKinney.
Had my hand raised. This is probably tied into the discussion that you just had, and Alder Revere brought it up. And so, in the area of programming for youth, is that one of those priority schedules, and will that be also on the discussion, Madam Mayor, as we're looking at collaborative programs and dollars that are set aside specifically for developing youth programs? I'm sure it was, but I just wanted to hear.
Yep. Alder Harrington McKinney, that's absolutely right. I think that's a place where we might productively be able to partner with the school district in particular. I would just remind you and all of us that when we get into talking about funding programs, we need to be really careful because that's an ongoing expense with one-time money. And so any funding for youth programming, youth employment, whatever it might be, would need to clearly have a sunset date, right? Or have a plan to replace the funding with levy dollars. Because these dollars are going to be spent and go away, and we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we're overextending our operating budget because of the use of these funds. But I do think that there's obviously an impact from the pandemic in youth programming, and it might be appropriate to use some of this funds for a 1, maybe 2 year something. And that would definitely be part of what I would want to talk about with the school district to see what they have in mind. Are there other questions for Dave or for me? All right, seeing none, I just want to close by thanking Dave and the finance staff for the work that they've done to track this and to try and understand everything that's going on at the federal level. And also the funding and recovery team that has been putting in just a tremendous amount of work to understand all of these different pots of money, what kinds of programs are appropriate for them, and to really generate ideas, to understand the gaps, and to put us collectively in a much better situation of being able to understand and leverage and really get, as I've been saying, every single penny of the federal dollars that might be available to us, to our community, to make a difference. So huge thanks to staff for all the work that they've been putting in, many hours, sometimes at very short notice, to put us in that situation. I believe that brings us to the end of our agenda. And given the givens, I would like to turn to Alder Bedar for a motion.
I move adjournment.
Second.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. Thank you, Alder Bedar, for your years of
Was my last
service.
city meeting.
On particularly on the Finance Committee, we appreciate your service.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck, and thank you, city staff, Dave and team.
Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of adjournment? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your night.